Well, speaking of the Tiananmen Square Massacre, maybe let's talk a little bit about Hong Kong this week. Because the Tiananmen Square, like inside China, no one's allowed to talk about the Tiananmen Square Massacre. It's like it's been memory hold. People actually don't know that it ever happened. I occasionally meet like Chinese people who come abroad and like they have a moment where they like see that footage for the first time and they're like, what?
Right.
When did this happen?
Yes, I actually had that experience. My sister and I were in Philadelphia, and I had lived in Philadelphia in college, but I'd never gone to see the Liberty Bell.
Mm-hmm.
So we were like, let's go check out the Liberty Bell. And at the Liberty Bell, they were playing a video about all of like what the Liberty Bell represents, freedom, etc., and what it represents around the world. And there was this humongous Chinese tourist group. So the video was in Chinese. And when it talked about, people around the world still not having freedom, like that, there are a lot of places around the world that don't have this kind of freedom. One of the scenes it showed was the Tiananmen Square protests. And this girl who was standing next to me, like leaned over to her friend and went, "Is that China?"
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Quick side note, considering all you do to fight authoritarianism and raise awareness about democracy, I'm going to start calling you Liberty Bell.
It kind of rhymes.
Rhymes?
Shelley, Liberty, Shell, Liberty Bell. I don't know.
At any rate, well, so this reminds me of a story that a Chinese American had told me about. Like he was in Beijing during the Tiananmen Square protest, and he wasn't out there on the night of June 3rd, but he kind of like went the next day and then like riding their bike, he and his friends riding their bikes around. Anyway, like one of the interesting things was that like it was so clear what had happened, but by the next day, like everything had been cleaned up. And then he said like the worst part wasn't the massacre. It was the total silence of people. Like, he's like, no one, like after a couple days, no one in Beijing would talk about what happened. So it was almost like there was so much fear created by that people
themselves.
Exactly. They memory hold it themselves. It's like this deep trauma that never gets healed.
But people still know. They're just afraid of talking about it with people.
But then their kids don't know.
Yeah. Oh, actually, when my mom went back to China in 1993, I think is the first time she went back post Tiananmen Square Massacre. And she had family members say to her, "Oh, it's what happened in Tiananmen Square wasn't what they say happened." And she was like, "We know, like the entire world knows, essentially." And so people inside China did not realize kind of how international that news had become.
Well, and so that's the thing about Hong Kong. Like the Communist Party was never happy that, right there, Hong Kong every year would hold, memorials for the Tiananmen Square Massacre. It's a part of China, but they're still talking about the thing that nobody else in the rest of China is allowed to talk about. But, thanks to this new national security law, they've been able to start changing that.
It's the first year they canceled the memorial for COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And then this year, I think COVID restrictions were still happening, but
yeah, I think they still use the COVID excuse. But when it comes to next year, what are they going to still say it's COVID, or
at the rate that Hong Kong is going, maybe. Like they have a 3-week quarantine.
Oh. Which I hear Chinese athletes who just came into Hong Kong like this past week didn't have to quarantine.
Yeah, although Nicole Kidman also went to Hong Kong to shoot some movie and or TV show, and they didn't make her quarantine. People were really upset about that.
Well, but so yeah, like there's been this whole assault on like making sure people in Hong Kong forget about the Tiananmen Square Massacre too.
I think it's more like they're concerned about it being passed on to the next generation.
Well, yeah, exactly. Right. The same thing.
So it's like it's one thing if people who lived in Beijing 30 years ago remember the Tiananmen Square Massacre. It's a whole other thing if they're telling their kids about it. right? And then those kids tell their kids. And so then, like, if you can just keep it within that one generation, eventually they're going to all die off. And then the whole thing goes away, right? It's like, how many people alive today remember the torture and brainwashing that Mao Zedong did in Yan'an in the late 30s and the 40s? Like that's been memory hold because so few people who were there are still alive today, right? And they're not passing it on because it wasn't well documented. The problem is that Hong Kong is doing what no other city in China is doing, which is trying to keep that memory alive and then pass it on through history. So that needs to be stopped.
Right. So that's why they're taking books off the shelves that talk about the Tiananmen Square Massacre.
Which was the big story that came out this week from Hong Kong Free Press. That was their exclusive story. They went to these libraries in Hong Kong and actually have documented that, these books are disappearing. And the ones that are left, like they're not on the location, or if they're there, you can only read them there. You can't check them out.
Or you have to specially request them. Like they're not on the shelves. You have to make a request this book.
Leave your name and address.
Yeah, that's the thing, right?
Yeah.
Then are you going to get in trouble later for requesting this book about the Tiananmen Square Massacre? Weird to think that could be what happens in Hong Kong very soon, right?
Yeah.
They closed the Tiananmen. There was a museum that opened about the Tiananmen Square Massacre that was forced to close almost immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And that Pillar of Shame statue, which was at a university in Hong Kong, the university was essentially forced to take it down.
Yeah, commemorating the people who died in the Tiananmen Square Massacre. And nobody really knows how many people died. There's a huge range of estimates.
Yeah, I mean, from a few hundred to tens of thousands.
I think tens of thousands, yeah.
But probably it's in the thousands.
Mm-hmm.
That's another thing that was memory hold. Famously, for years, there were the Tiananmen mothers, who were, parents of students who died during the massacre, trying to get acknowledgement from the government.
Mm.
And like you were saying, Matt, about, eventually people will die off. Like a lot of the Tiananmen mothers are very old now. And there was a story in maybe the New York Times last year about how, that as the Tiananmen mothers are getting older, they're thinking nobody can carry on their mission, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of people are either passing away or just kind of giving up after 30 plus years of not being able to get any kind of resolution.
Yeah.
So then when they stop advocating, because that was very sympathetic to people outside China, people who their kids were killed, right? So that was like a very powerful thing that the Chinese Communist Party hated. They were getting so much attention in the years after the massacre. And so now they're just kind of like, well, they're going to die soon.
And yeah, without that kind of visceral representation of how horrible it was, we've seen the Chinese Communist Party get more successful at getting Western media or other Western organizations to refer to it as the Tiananmen Square incident. Mm-hmm. It's not a massacre, Tiananmen Square incident.
I mean, there is some technical, the massacre didn't happen inside Tiananmen Square, which is true. Most people died in the streets outside the square, but no one would be like, if your argument is it should be called the Chang'an Avenue Massacre,
Yeah. I mean, it's like people who are like, well, technically the Vietnam War was not a war, it was a conflict. It's like, shut up. We all know what we're talking about.
But yeah, so the Tiananmen Square Massacre.
Yeah. For the Tiananmen Square mothers, a big thing is, for decades, China had a one-child policy. So obviously, when you're only allowed one child and that child gets run over by a tank, it's very devastating.